I'm Edie Lush, Executive Editor of Hub Culture. Absolutely delighted now to be joined by Marisa Drew. Thanks for joining me.
Real pleasure to be here.
So we're here at COP26 in Glasgow. Marisa is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Credit Suisse. So I'd love for you to set out, first of all, the challenge that finance faces when you look at climate change.
Sure. Well, it's a big number. I think that's the biggest challenge. We tend in finance to look at things from both a risk and an opportunity point of view. The risk side is pretty clear. We are sitting here with the IPCC report telling us that we're on a path, if we do nothing, to 4 degrees Celsius, which is catastrophic for humanity. 4 degrees Celsius in risk terms means that we will have 40 times the number of catastrophic storm activity, water shortages, wildfires, all the things that we've been experiencing this summer. So it really means an uninhabitable planet. So that's I'd say our North Star in some ways. And the academics would tell you that we need about 90 to 100 trillion to be invested in order to mitigate climate change and keep us around that 1.5 C. So that's the risk side. Now, if you're a finance person, you also ask yourself, what's the opportunity? And I often use the quote of Al Gore, which is, if you help to invest to protect against this catastrophic issue, it will actually prove to be the biggest investment opportunity in history. And to quote him, he says, it is the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but moving at the speed of digital. So that's quite provocative as an investor, because if you invest behind policy change, some of the things that we're seeing here, whether it's the commitment on deforestation or curbing methane or what have you, as we move to a decarbonized world, opportunities will present themselves everywhere. Look at something like electric vehicles and how quickly that came on the scene, and look at the valuations of those participating. And for every industry, you have an investment opportunity like that. Some of it will be the climate disruptors, so these young companies that are usually mission driven by someone who's 30-something,
right,
that are attacking these industries. But it presents as an investor opportunities to deploy the capital at scale and generate huge returns.
So this COP is different from the ones that you and I probably have attended before. We're old enough to remember Copenhagen, Paris, all the other ones. How important is it of the scale of the inclusion of finance in this?
Yes. So historically, one thought of COP as just being an intergovernmental convening effect. And what we see now is a massive amount of participation from the corporate sector. Just leading up to COP, we had some 2,000 plus companies commit to net zero pledges, and this is the corporate sector. We've had finance, 47 trillion pre-COP, and now we're up to about 130 trillion of commitments from finance and asset management. And this participation from all these stakeholders is a big deal, because we've got to work collaboratively. It can't just be the purview of government. It can't just be the purview of the private sector. All of us are needed if we're going to make this thing happen.
So, but we do need these policy changes from government. So tell me the things that you've heard so far that you think are, okay, that's good, we can invest in that.
So big deals. That were, and some were expected, but some were not. So we've had a global commitment to stop deforestation, big deal, particularly in Latin American countries, which often weren't necessarily participating in the topic. That is massive for climate change, and it's going to create investment opportunities as we look at investing in nature solutions like trees and forests, sustainably managed forests. The curb on methane, huge, because we've all talked about following carbon emissions reductions, but methane is a big piece of climate mitigation. We've also had a global pledge finally to phase out coal, even with the emerging market countries. Again, a very, very big deal. So these are some of the things that get me excited and give me hope, and also give me enthusiasm with my investment hat on, that there's money to be made by following the policymaking.
What else do you want to come out of this talk?
Oh gosh, my one hope, which I think is probably a little Pollyanna-ish at the moment, based on what I see, would be an absolute agreement on a carbon price. Because if we can get a price on carbon, and effectively becomes, if you want to call it carbon tax, pricing carbon into everything we do will completely reshape the allocation of capital. If you start all those negative things, if you start pricing the cost of that, they will be untenable. and the capital will flow to the places that are sustainable, and that would be a catalyst for an even greater acceleration. It's very hard, and I don't think it's going to happen out of COP, sadly, but that would be my wish.
Okay, let's talk about some of the hurdles within the finance sector. Now, one of the issue is around standards, so just break that down for me.
Yes. So if you're an investor today, it's standards, data, disclosure is the biggies, the big ones that we hear over and over again. If you're an investor, to make an informed investment choice, what you want is a consistency and a harmony of data. So if you're just determining one company versus another company, today the data is not comparable. You don't have apples to apples. A good thing that's come out of COP, and by the way, there are numerous organizations that we're all trying to dance around creating these standards. And the problem is, if you're in finance, you can't have 10 standards. There needs to be one globally adopted standard. So under the auspices of the IFRS, you see now consolidation of SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, the Carbon Disclosure Standards Board, IFRS, and many others are consolidating into one group that is going to attempt to create a new accounting standard for sustainability. That will be fantastic for the finance community to get behind. So that's one of them. Another hurdle that we hear over and over again is there's an acknowledgement that we need to finance the transition, but there's a deep fear of greenwashing. So what is a credible transition versus an empty promise? We've been hard at work working with a nonprofit called the Climate Bond Initiative, who were the original architects of the green bond principles, to actually define what a credible transition is. If we can get a globally adopted agreement on what does it mean, and it's got to be ambitious, it's got to be backed up by science. There's a place for carbon offsets for the hard to abate sectors, but it cannot be an excuse to keep doing what you're doing.
Right.
So we need to have rules around what carbon offsetting is appropriate for. So those are all the things that we're trying to do. And then other areas that we often hear from investors, particularly in areas that are underinvested, is that the capital's here, we want to invest, we just don't have investable structures that speak to us and our needs as investors. So we've been working on trying to unblock some of those hurdles as well.
So let's talk about that, about what those investment opportunities could be. So one thing I'd love to know is, can you invest in the ocean?
That's one of my favorite topics. I was shocked. I charged our teams to take a look at the UN SDGs, map them, and identify where there was an underinvestment of private capital. I was shocked when we found that the oceans are the second least of the SDGs from investment point of view, private capital point of view. Shocking, given how critical oceans are to our health. It gives us the oxygen, it mitigates 93% of the climate heat, it sequesters a quarter of our carbon, and feeds a quarter of the world's population. And yet it's underinvested. Why is that? We went and we polled the investment community. These are the asset managers that run billions of pools of capital, asking them, do you think it's investable? And if it is, do you care? If you care and you think it's investable, why haven't you invested? And the answer that we got back very much was nobody has created something at scale that speaks to our needs and investors. So we rolled up our sleeves and we got to work saying, well, we can change that. That's what we do. And in this instance, we created a fund that uses the power of shareholder engagement to drive behavior change of companies, nudging them to be better ocean stewards, with the theory that if they do that, they'll create value for themselves and the investor. And so our capital is tied to those outcomes. And we launched that fund, and within a couple of months, we raised hundreds of millions of capital. So now we're up north of half a billion. And that's a very big deal, because if you'd asked the NGO community 5 years ago, could you mobilize $500 million of capital for ocean conservation, they would have told you you're completely crazy. And we did it. So we're off.
And so what are the projects that
we've identified companies who we think can be better ocean stewards, and we call them ocean improvers. And then we engage with them. And one of the nice things about this fund is it is a collaborative effort. So informing us on the advisory board is a foundation, a nonprofit called the Ocean Foundation, that's been doing amazing work in the oceans for well over a decade. And so they can identify at a company level, these are things you could do. So for instance, if a company has leaking factories that put effluent into waterways which get in the ocean and kill fish and ruin the corals and all that, the companies could fix these kinds of tweaks. And oftentimes, that's quite a simplistic example, but there are many of those kinds of examples where just a little bit of intervention can stop a big problem, and then, like we say, create value for the company itself and also the investors.
Extraordinary. Okay, the last big topic is blended finance.
Blended finance, yes.
Talk me through why it's so hard.
Yeah. So blended finance, for those who aren't familiar with it, is when you bring non-traditional actors into the same project or structure, finance structure, within the belief that the different expertise and skill set that those actors bring will unlock some of the stuck problems. Now that's the theory, and it is a great theory. And sometimes one party brings something that will then allow other capital to flow. And the traditional sense is if you have a multilateral development funding bank, or if you have somebody else who can take risk off the table, then that allows the private sector to come in. Easier said than done, because we've all been operating for a very long time in our silos, not really talking to each other, and there's a lot of embedded assumptions about what we can do or about what they can do. And when you get everybody in a room and you actually try to put yourself in each other's shoes, and you get a shared understanding around a common mission, then sparks fly. And so we've been very fortunate to be involved in some blended finance structures. And just on Friday, we announced another project that is very helpful to the oceans, which is a debt restructuring, which we call debt for nature swaps, where many of the island nations during COVID were catastrophically hit because without tourism, they're in a bad way. And the island of Belize was particularly hard hit, and they were having trouble servicing their debts. And so we basically went to them with the Nature Conservancy, so an NGO, who's been doing amazing work for a very long time in the oceans. And we said to them, we will help to restructure your debts if and only if you take a portion of the proceeds of this and you invest in marine conservation. So it's a quid pro quo. We also got the U.S. government in to help provide a credit wrapper to enhance, because today Belize is a very low-rated country because of the trouble they had with their debts. And for the investment community, the really strong institutional investors, they were prohibited from investing because of the credit rating. And so by enhancing the rating, all of a sudden now you have very, very strong institutional investors, pension funds and insurance companies that all could participate. And we underwrote that debt of it's north of $350 million. Biggest debt for nature swap that's been done by a factor of 5 or 10. And now what have you got? You have a sustainable debt structure in the country. You have investment in marine conservation. No doubt that's going to attract tourists who care, which is going to create more revenues for the country, which is going to be a win-win-win. So we all win. We win as investors, the government wins, the Nature Conservancy wins. It's kind of a really beautiful story of
Amazing.
finance.
Amazing. Marisa, thank you so much for stopping by my little stand here at the World Climate Summit. I'm Edie Lush.